I can imagine everyone in this room is at least slightly relieved the 2020 election is finally over. For months, we all watched and listened to our incumbents and prospective representatives fighting. They argued about everything we would expect from immigration, COVID 19, climate change, and so many other hot button topics. One of those topics was who should be allowed to vote, also known as voter disenfranchisement and voter registration regulations. Since long before the 2020 election, voting rights has been a huge issue in this country. The people most often affected by disenfranchisement and stricter voting laws are minority groups, people of color, and felons. In a 2020 article written by Ugin for the Sentencing Project, they share that one of every 16 African Americans has lost their voting rights due to felony disenfranchisement laws, versus one in every 59 non-black voters. That is a lot of people whose voices aren't heard, and why. So what exactly is voter disenfranchisement? Voter disenfranchisement is losing your voting rights due to a felony conviction. There isn't a federal law that dictates who, when, or how long people are disenfranchised, because each state decides their own laws. Felons in different states have different rights. According to the ACLU, some states ban voting only during incarceration, some ban voting for life, some ban people while on probation or parole, other ban people from voting only while incarcerated. It's important to note that disenfranchisement isn't the only way people lose their right to vote. Voter suppression is just as serious as disenfranchisement. In fact, in a 2020 article, the ACLU states that suppression efforts range from the seemingly unobstructive, like voter ID laws and cuts to early voting, to mass purges of voter rolls and systematic disenfranchisement. Voter suppression comes in many forms, like germinating or registration restrictions, but strict voter ID laws keep many Americans from voting. In a 2020 article, voter identification laws share that voter ID requirements will disproportionately affect certain groups of voters who are more likely not to have government-issued IDs, such as low-income and minority voters and students. Some politicians, traditionally Republicans, want stricter voting ID laws to protect election security. Unfortunately, it hasn't been proven to prevent election voter fraud. In fact, that same article goes on to say that ID requirements will not affect voter confidence in elections, but will negatively impact voter turnout. Between disenfranchisement and suppression, so many Americans are not able to vote. Who is disenfranchised? Who is most affected? In regard to the 2020 election, Ugin wrote, in voting rights that 5.2 million Americans cannot vote because of felony conviction, because of a mistake they made recently or 50 years ago. 5.2 million Americans cannot vote. How can we say our government is by the people, for the people, if we take away voting rights from 5.2 million citizens? Out of the 5.2 million Americans, who is the most affected by voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement? According to the ACLU, certain communities are particularly susceptible to suppression and in some cases outright targeted. People of color, students, the elderly, the people with disabilities. While voter disenfranchisement is different than voter suppression, it is important to realize that both are attempts to silence the same groups of people. In a 2008 article, Disenfranchisement of Felons say that even today, felon disenfranchisement laws disproportionately affect blacks. The United States is one of the only few democratic countries that systematically disenfranchise convicted felons. It's hard to imagine why there are so many people still being excluded from voting in 2020. and why our representatives aren't concerned with representing all of their constituents. Should politicians show concern for marginalized groups, or should they focus more on the American people as a whole? Those are questions many of us have never had to stop and consider. Most of us likely not found in the position to advocate for the rights of minority groups, however, our politicians are. When politicians specifically speak to one group of people or on one issue, it's called identity politics. In an article titled Identity Politics from 2020, they clearly define the term. The focus typically falls on women, racial minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ people, and religious minorities, such as Muslim Americans. All the social issues you may have heard of in the past several years, same-sex marriage, police shootings of unarmed black men, trans people in bathrooms, the fluidity, gender, discussions about rape culture, campus battles about safety, spaces, and trigger warnings are typically the kind of issues people mean when they refer to identity politics. That long list of people issues includes felony disenfranchisement. So should politicians be concerned with felons? Should they fight for felons to have their rights restored? According to identity politics, those who dislike this practice may believe that focusing on the economy, healthcare, and other issues that most matter to Americans is a sounder electoral strategy that pandering to the narrowing interests of small groups. However, every politician was elected to represent all of their constituents. They weren't elected to simply appease their supporters or to vote in line with their party. They were elected to represent the people. You simply cannot represent all of your constituents if you won't interact with certain groups of them. More politicians need to be concerned with the struggles and violations of their rights in minority groups. Although felons face unfair law in many states, there are a few states who have not disenfranchised them. As we discussed above, the ACLU tells us that the laws vary by state. Some states restore felon rights after incarceration, some never get their rights restored, and some never lose their rights at all. Having varying laws can be confusing, but this is a great introductory visual to what states do what. As you can see, some states have similar laws. The severity of the laws varies from state to state. In voting rights, Ugin shares two important pieces of information with us. First, the D.C. Council passed legislation authorizing voting by residents incarcerated in jail or prison with felony conviction. The district joins just two states, Maine and Vermont, that maintain voting rights for imprisoned citizens. And finally, on August 17, 2020, Governor Kim Reynolds signed an executive order to restore felons' voting rights. Iowa was the only state that still permanently disenfranchised those with felony conviction unless the governor intervened. It varies state to state, but all states should restore the rights of felons. It may seem like common sense or something that simply doesn't need said, but felons are people and deserve to vote. Voter disenfranchisement stopped 5.2 million people from voting in the 2020 election. Of those people, African American voters are disproportionately affected. In fact, one of every 16 African Americans has lost their right to vote due to felony disenfranchisement. Politicians have been arguing about this for years. Should felons be allowed to vote? The goal of the American government is to provide the people for the people. We cannot complete that goal without considering the very people that the government is supposed to be there for. Every voice in America deserves to be heard.